Hello, and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today, we're going to be talking about the Iran nuclear deal. This is a subject that we'll be diving in on at some length over the coming months. It's one of the most important foreign policy questions of the early Biden administration, whether or not they're going to get into it, what that might get back into it, what that might involve, that sort of thing. But what I want to talk about today is something that I don't think anybody talks about much because it's the actual real case for the JCPOA, for the Iran nuclear deal that a lot of people don't make. Put simply, the JCPOA, the real reason for the Iran nuclear deal is getting the US out of the Middle East. And even the biggest proponents of the JCPOA seem to be reluctant to make that as explicit as they should. So that's sort of what today's talk is going to be about, sort of the bigger picture stuff, not getting into the minutiae. For those of you who are new, this is the More Freedom Foundation's monthly live public newscast. We do two, one that's public, one for patrons only. And in these public ones, what we do is we do a half hour, 45-minute, however long it takes presentation, during which I pay absolutely no attention to the live chat. And then the balance of the 2 hours, however long that is, will be spent on Q&A, sort of general discussion generated by whatever is in the live chat. Have fun in the live chat as I'm talking. We are very free with what you say, as long as you're not actively disrupting or spamming the chat. You can say pretty much whatever you want. However, we do and you're allowed to say whatever you want about me, my physical appearance, the ideas that I'm expressing. If you think I talk funny, whatever, go for it. You are more than welcome to do so. However, we do have a very hard and fast rule here, is that you are obligated to be civil to other people in the chat. You are not allowed to go after each other in the chat. You're not allowed to attack each other. You're allowed to attack each other's ideas, of course, but no personal attacks. In order to make sure that that continues to happen, Loga Cool Extreme is our moderator. So do what Loga says. He has untrammeled powers. There is no court of appeal from Loga. If he decides that you're being disruptive, he will warn you. And then I encourage you to listen to his warning and change your behavior, because if you do not, he can ban you, he can suspend you, he can do all manner of things. So do not trifle with Logan, and let's keep this civil, because it is, of course, a tremendously important question. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, an extraordinarily complex agreement, something that took years to put together, that involved multiple US government agencies, multiple international agencies, and of course, multiple countries, as an agreement that was put together to constrain the nuclear program of Iran. I am kind of dreading the discussions of this deal that are upcoming, because I just know how incredibly stupid they're going to be. This is, again, a tremendously complex thing. I know there's Peter Zeihan, who's a geopolitical analyst that a lot of folks like. I like some aspects of what he talks about. But I was reading some summing up he did, and he was talking about how the Democrats don't really have any real valid foreign policy experience and some kind of forecast for the coming years. And I just had to stop reading right there, because I was like, oh, clearly on this topic at least, Peter Zeihan has no fucking idea what he's talking about, because the JCPOA was something of immense complexity, and as Republicans will point out, an aspect of that incredible complexity was the fact that Barack Obama had to figure out a way to make this deal happen against the die-hard opposition of the warmongering Republican Party that desperately wanted to make sure that the JCPOA did not happen. So yeah, it's a tremendously complex thing, but the arguments that we're going to be hearing about this in the coming months are going to be just so incredibly stupid. And I think that advocates of the JCPOA sort of set themselves up for the stupidity of these arguments because they're reluctant to make the actual case for the Iran nuclear deal. Yes, the Iran nuclear deal is, in a very limited sense, about uh, keeping Iran from developing nuclear weapons. And anybody who actually knows anything about arms reduction, arms deals, and what is possible in international politics thinks that this is a very good deal aimed towards that goal. It's easy for idiots to tear it down, to look, well, this provision sunsets after a certain point, or this, or this, or this. It's very easy to quibble with. But that leaves aside what the broader purpose of this agreement is. Before I get into that, I think I want to talk about something I've been talking about a lot on the private patrons only newscasts, but I think is a really vitally important aspect of this that you need to understand if you're going to have any sense of what's going on with this tremendously important and tremendously complex subject, the Iran nuclear deal. It's easy to look at this as, you know, there are opposing sides here. There's Iran on one side, and then there's the international community on the other that wants to constrain Iran and make certain that Iran is not allowed to do certain things with its nuclear program. So a lot of the coverage is going to focus on what does Iran want? What does Biden want? How are Biden and Iran going back and forth and arguing about things? What's that all about? And that's not really what this political issue is about. That's not what the political negotiation that matters is. Infinitely important, infinitely more important than the negotiations that are going to go on between Iran and the United States are the negotiations that are going to go on within the United States, within one city in the United States. What matters for the Iran nuclear deal and its future, has very little to do with Iran and the actions that it takes. Of course, Iran, if it chooses, can take actions that blow this up and make it impossible, or this, that, and the other thing. But really, Iran over the past 4 years has distinguished itself as an extraordinarily rational, serious actor on the geopolitical stage. And the United States has distinguished itself as not being so. Iran's position is very clear, it is very rational, it is very legal, and very sensible. The only question is how fucking nuts is the United States going to continue to be? And that is entirely dependent on negotiations within the Biden administration, negotiations between the Biden administration and the US Congress, negotiations within the think tank community of Washington, D.C. This is one of those absurd situations where, which are unfortunately most of U.S. foreign policy, where something that's supposed to be about the relations between the United States and another country are really just about internal politics in the United States. It is vastly more important for the future of the Iran nuclear deal which think tank schmucks get listened to more in the Biden administrative wings, you know, more at the State Department or the DOD. So this is not really a geopolitics, international relations question. This is an internal politics of Washington, D.C. question. The important thing to realize is that the folks making these decisions know a shit ton less about the region and what the real stakes are here than anybody, than most people who are on the live chat right now. It is staggering how ignorant these people are. So that's why I kind of wanted to step back and do some big picture stuff. I think already, I haven't looked in the live chat, but I'm sure there's people who are objecting. They're like, oh, you know, this isn't about Washington, D.C. This is about Israel, or this is about the UAE, and this is about Saudi Arabia. And the thing you have to understand about those very not powerful countries, those small Middle Eastern countries, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia is a little bit bigger, but makes up for its larger size with its incredible inadequacy and weakness as compared to Israel and the UAE. These are countries that don't have real international power the way that other actors in this conversation do, actors like Russia, Iran, the United States, even France. They're not serious countries. Their And their policy confirms this. They confirm that they are not serious countries worthy of being engaged on this issue because they have no agenda other than to suck the United States military into doing things, than making the manipulating Washington, D.C. in such a way as to make the United States and the United States military serve their agendas because they don't have the independent power or ability to act as real powers. I think that's an important thing that needs to be emphasized here. The fact that what's most important for Israeli, UAE, and Saudi foreign policy doesn't happen in the Persian Gulf. It happens in Washington, D.C. too. So I'm not denying, of course, that Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE have way too much influence on this process. I'm saying that that's really just an internal Washington, D.C. issue as well. Really, and this is something that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel volunteer every time, make very clear every time they weigh in on this issue, is that they don't have individual sovereignty on this issue. They don't have the power necessary to do anything. Israel likes to dick wave and say, oh, look, we murdered all these Iranian scientists, we're killing people, we're killing all these Iranian soldiers in Syria. They love to do that to pretend they have this independent power and say, oh, well, you know, if you do the Iran deal, then we're going to start bombing Tehran more. That's a pretense of independent power. That is saying that because the unspoken thing there is that they're able to act this way as sort of a rinky-dink little country because the United States is always behind them and they can always rely upon that. And that's true. Israel will always be able to rely on the United States behind them. But you have to understand that Israel and what matters for Israel's impact on this situation is not the fact that they can bomb some people or they came up with some new special way to assassinate old men in Tehran. It's because they have power in Washington, D.C. It's because the UAE has purchased a lot of people in Washington, D.C. It's because Saudi Arabia has dumped a lot of money in think tanks in Washington, D.C. I think that's a really fundamental thing, you know, when we're talking about Israel or Saudi Arabia or UAE's influence in Washington, D.C., which is strong. It's not a statement about the strength of these countries. It's a statement about the weakness and the lack of seriousness of these countries. Israel is essentially the 51st state. I mean, that's the way it's always has been, and really the way it always would be. I'm critical of Israel often, but I don't think it is entirely inappropriate that Israel has influence in the United States. I do think it is entirely inappropriate that the UAE and Saudi Arabia have the influence that they have in the United States. These places are U.S. colonies and overly influential U.S. colonies because we let some of the people that we allow to have power in Saudi Arabia and the UAE act out in ways that are enriching to some aspects of U.S. elites, but are unhelpful to foreign policy more generally. I feel like I may be running into a bit of a ditch here, but I just sort of want to make it clear that what matters over the next 6 months is not what matters about Iran is actually very straightforward. And the reason that why Washington, D.C. and internal discussions in Washington, D.C. matter so much is because Iran is being quite irrational and quite straightforward. It has set out a very public and obvious timeline of consequences for the United States not acting the way that it should, for the United States continuing to dick around with the JCPOA, an agreement that Biden has already publicly committed to rejoining. And you know what? They wouldn't even have been put together this timeline if Israel hadn't assassinated a retired Iranian nuclear scientist in November of last year. When that happened in November, in response, the Iranian parliament enacted a law that puts together a very straightforward timeline of consequences. 30 days after that, in December of 2020, they started enriching uranium to a higher level of purity in certain very clearly publicized ways. February 21st, there is the International Atomic Energy Agency additional protocol, which is something that was agreed to as part of the JCPOA. And on February 21st, Iran will stop honoring those stop honoring those requirements because again. The United States has been flagrantly violating the JCPOA for the past 3 years. And then I believe somewhere in the March 20s, they will start bringing back centrifuges. So Iran very rationally, very straightforwardly, in much more rational response to the murder of a retired scientist by a foreign country than I think we would have undertaken, has laid out very straightforward consequences. And then, of course, there's the big one. Friday, June 18th, is the election of the next president. That will almost certainly be a much more hardline Iranian president than the current moderate one. And I was looking for it, but I could not find exactly when that person came into office. So all of that is vaguely important, but as the Trump administration has shown, Iran is deeply rational and has a position that I don't believe will actually change that much with a hardliner president. It could, which means that we should do all that we can to get the JCPOA back into force before June 18th. But Iran is honest, straightforward, and clear about its requirements. It's the United States that is the dishonest, extraordinarily violent, insane clusterfuck. So there are people within the Biden administration, and it has been heartening how many sane people that Biden seems to have hired into the Biden administration that want to get back into the JCPOA for the very good reasons I will finally get around to outlining in a minute or two. But they've got to argue with the other people in the Biden administration that were hired that are insane neocons. They have to argue with the entire think tank infrastructure of Washington, D.C., all of the defense contractors, those little tin pot, the leadership of those little tin pot Middle Eastern countries I just I mentioned that basically work for those defense companies. There's the real discussion is in Washington, D.C. So that's what's going on here. That's what we're going to be engaging with over the coming spring. What I should finally do is make the case for the JCPOA. We're not going to get into the minutiae of sunset clauses, this, that, and the other thing today. But put most simply, the real reason for the JCPOA, I'm not sure whether the Iran nuclear deal is the most sensible thing that the U.S. government has done this century, or the only sensible thing that the U.S. government has done in foreign policy this century. What the JCPOA is about fundamentally is not Iran's nuclear program. It is about starting a pathway for the United States out of the Middle East. And while I have many, 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 many quibbles with the presidency of Barack Obama, which I've outlined in great detail in other places on this channel, it's why I really do believe that the JCPOA was so extraordinary and such a positive thing, is because it goes directly against the trajectory of U.S. foreign policy and government since the end of the Cold War. The whole point of the Middle East, from the perspective of the United States government, the United States military-industrial complex, is the manufacture of instability. It is making a place where the United States can sell weapons, can demonstrate weapons, and can continue to sell weapons. The JCPOA is a way to attempt to step out of that, to get out of that problem. What the Middle East desperately needs is stability. Unlike everywhere else in the world, it did not get the benefit from the end of the Cold War. There's nothing special about the Middle East. There's nothing special about Sunnis or Shias or even Israelis versus Arabs. What's different about the Middle East is that they didn't get the end of the Cold War. Latin America, up and through the 1980s, Asia through the 1980s, most regions of Africa through the 1980s were in just as desperate or even dramatically worse circumstances than the Middle East as recently as the 1980s, because the United States and the Soviet Union were eager to engage in proxy warring on every front. Let's not let individual countries off the hook entirely. Wars do happen without the horror of outside sponsors, but they're much more likely with the horror of outside sponsors and regional sponsorship. When the Cold War ended, it was extraordinary How quickly many regions in the world started to sort themselves out. Of course, there were great horrors in sort of Central Africa in the 1990s, but those horrors were a result of folks like Mobutu Sese Seko, I'm sure I mispronounced that, the guy in charge of what was then known as Zaire, who was mostly just a sort of U.S. puppet. His falling apart led to a horrific conflict in the 1990s. But once these things played themselves out, all of a sudden the world got dramatically more peaceful because the United States and the Soviet Union were no longer fighting over every part of the world. In the Middle East, the Middle East did not get that benefit because the United States, arguably quite consciously, got into the Middle East in a much bigger way when the Cold War ended, and put countries like Iran, Iraq, and mostly Iran, Iraq, and now latterly Russia as well, into a position of being competitors against the U.S. bloc, which is Saudi Arabia, Israel, UAE, mostly Egypt as well to an extent. So that's the problem with the Middle East, and it is a problem that the United States has gleefully exacerbated, has made worse at every turn because it's great for Washington, D.C., defense contractors, and their pet congresspeople and pet leaderships of countries like Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And it's a horrific nightmare that is completely useless. It has led to things like 9/11. It has led to terrorist attacks in the United States. It has led to the loss of easily around 1 million, probably significantly more lives in the Middle East over the recent years, and just an incredible waste of money. Roughly a third of the U.S. national debt can be attributed to forever war aspects, sort of unnecessary military spending over the past 30 years. It's just an incredible clusterfuck. And what the JCPOA is about finally settling one of the main axes of geopolitical rivalry that's there. Now, that doesn't mean resolving this sort of geopolitical liability. It means getting it to a point of stability. It's the United States that is the main element of instability. I'm a big fan of ending the war, ending U.S. participation in the war in Yemen. That doesn't mean that Yemen is instantly going to become peaceful. It could even mean that things very briefly get more violent in Yemen. But by removing the United States, by removing that aspect of just keep staying in there, to just keep pushing things and fucking things up worse, there's a potential of stability. And with the JCPOA, the United States builds a framework, or was intended to build a framework upon which more and more peaceful aspects with Iran could have been built. Because there is no reason for the United States to be as present in the Middle East as it is today. What the United States wants is for nobody to control the Middle East other than ourselves. And the thing is, all of the necessary pieces are there. Turkey is a large, powerful, militarily involved country that has been a power in the Middle East as itself and as its predecessor for 800 years. Iran has the potential to be a more powerful country that would balance Turkey. Iran and Turkey have fought for almost a millennia. Now it seems, mostly because of the idiocy, the idiotic instability manufacturing that the United States has been doing for the past 3 years, it now seems that Russia is also a big power in the Middle East. It's perfect. All we have to do is leave, and then these powers will resolve themselves into a competitive equilibrium. Gosh, who knows? Even some of them will probably buy U.S. defense manufacturers, but they won't have the incentive that we do thousands of miles away to just keep this churn of disgusting violence going. These folks will pretty much, we've already got a sort of Russo-Turkish Cold War going that I've talked about, and all we have to do from the US perspective is leave. One of the things that I find most frustrating, and we'll go on about at great length in future videos, is that all the people who oppose the Iranian nuclear deal in the United States want it to be about stuff that isn't nukes. They want Iran to make commitments regarding its defense technology. They want Iran to commit to not having the same kinds of weapons that everybody else in the region has. They want Iran to commit to being a weaker country than everybody else in the region. They want Iran to commit to not having a foreign policy, to not sponsor elements in other in countries in the region. I mean, is that like, what is the United States going to stop sponsoring elements of governments in the region? It's ridiculous. So basically, what we're telling Iran that they can't have a nuclear deal and lift its sanctions unless they completely cut off their defense capability and cut off their foreign policy capability. It's absurd on its face, but when you look at it from the perspective of what's called offshore balancing, what the United States actually should be doing in the Middle East, if it's interested in focusing on China, as it claims to, if we focus on that, then actually, like, making Iran weaker isn't what we should want to be doing right now. We should want to be making Iran stronger so that it can act as a better counterbalance to Russia, act as a better counterbalance to Turkey and the rest of Europe. And yeah, that's a little unfortunate, a little shitty to Turkey and the rest of Europe, which are nominal treaty allies. But if we really want to be clever and smart about what's going on in the Middle East, then the JCPOA is perfect. If it strengthens Iran, I don't really think that it does so. But yeah, I mean, yes, I guess removing our sanctions against Iran and allowing them to participate in the world economy as a normal country again would, yes, make Iran stronger. And that serves the United States because the other option, what the opponents of the Iran nuclear deal want, is for the United States to stay in the Middle East forever. They want us to stay there forever with our soldiers dying, with our soldiers and our robots and our sanctions killing. They want the destabilization of the Middle East to continue forever. That's the real interest here. The real interest here is not concern about Iran's weapons of mass destruction. The real interest here, this is very important for Israel, this is very important for Saudi Arabia, it's very important for the UAE, isn't really as important for the United States, but it is very important for defense interests in the United States, is preserving Iran as an enemy. They don't want regime change in Iran. They don't really want an Iran that is more or less powerful than it is today. These countries are tremendously invested in having Iran as this scary bad guy, because if the leadership of Israel at this time, if the leadership of Saudi Arabia or the UAE at this time doesn't have an Iran that looks almost exactly the way it does today to point to, then they have to focus on their own crimes and insanities. And that is something that they desperately do not want to do. So that's what, like, I'm not sure if I've explained this quite as well as I ought to. The JCPOA is about building a Middle East where the United States just doesn't have to pay any attention to it anymore. Doesn't have to pay as much attention to it anymore. Where we don't have to have 60,000 troops. I think that's the estimate of the number of troops that we have in the Middle East right now. Sure, we're down to 3,000 to 5,000 in Iraq and Afghanistan, and under 1,000 in Syria. But we got troops in Kuwait, we got troops in Qatar, we got troops all over. And the current estimation that it's around 60,000 people in a region, 60,000 very expensive troops in a region that we just don't have to be involved in. We've got Russia and Turkey competing. And if we allow Iran to get stronger, it'll be this fantastic just mess of medium-sized powers who will want to craft a balance. They'll do it naturally without us being there. The problem is we have so much investment from the defense industry in Washington, D.C., so much investment in the United States having a presence there, making things less stable, being involved, and generating large profits and contracts for congresspeople, for all manner of industries throughout the country. It's just so frustrating. And the point of the JCPOA is to take just the first step back from that, to allow a framework where the Middle East can normalize and the United States can focus on other things. I would, of course, prefer that the United States focus on somehow addressing inequality in the United States, rebuilding some of this infrastructure that's falling apart everywhere. I think as we speak right now, Texas is going through a cold snap, and the failure of all of its natural gas plants, and some wind turbines. We've got this, both of our largest states in the past 6 months, with nominally completely different political orientations, have failed utterly, infrastructure speaking. That's stuff we should be focusing on. And maybe, I guess, if you're more hawkish or more national security oriented, then we should be focused on China. And that is also, if you're really concerned about China, you should be for the JCPOA, because the JCPOA is about taking the United States out of the Middle East. That is the goal, and that is sort of what makes sense to do. I think it's important to point out is that we've never really honored the JCPOA in the United States. There are clauses within that agreement that commit folks, signatories to that agreement, to not hampering Iran's economic development. In the deal, Iran agrees to really, some of the most onerous inspection and verification, I think the most onerous inspection and verification regime in the world. And in return, what they were promised was the ability to participate in the world economy. And the United States never really gave them that. I believe that the deal was signed in 2015. Important parts of the implementation started in mid-2016. And by the end of 2016, Donald Trump was the president of the United States and angrily shouting about how he was going to jump out of the Iran nuclear deal. And now he was constrained by people in his administration for about a year and a half. We did not formally leave the JCPOA until I think it was the spring of 2018. But in that year and a half, none of the things that should have been happening to begin to build on the JCPOA, not even the sanctions reductions that the JCPOA sort of implied, ever took place. So we never actually began to use the JCPOA. Never really happened. It hasn't been tried, and it's a profound pity, because the results have been quite shit. In fact, what I want to emphasize here is that, as I think I might have covered earlier, but I think is worth emphasizing again, is that Donald Trump proved that Iran is a rational actor. I think that's something that probably merits a video of its own, actually. But Donald Trump proved that the Iranians are the adults in the room, which is kind of an extraordinary thing. He tore up the JCPOA, took a piss on it and then burned it and then set it on fire. And the Iranians have at every stage reacted to truly extraordinary provocations by the United States. They killed the second most powerful person in the Iranian government when he was on his way to a peace conference in Iraq, invited by the Iraqi government. It's just extraordinary provocation. And in return, Iran was very careful to do what it had to do for its own self-respect, was to attack a U.S. facility in Iraq, but it warned the United States before it made the attack, so that there were no deaths. I mean, at every stage, it's quite extraordinary how Iran has acted with such sanity and restraint. Saudi Arabia has quite clearly been the major actor in this sabotage, and had been acting out in the early years of the Trump administration with just absolute batshit weirdness, abducting I think it was I can never remember whether it's the prime minister or the president of Lebanon, abducting a head of state. Like that's like Bond villain, James Bond villain horse shit. But that's things that the Saudi government was doing. The Saudis were acting, completely insane, and pushing very hard for their patron, the United States, to destroy Iran. And Iran took a very measured, very clear step against Iran. Made it very clear to Iran that the first casualty. Sorry, Iran made it very clear to Saudi Arabia that the first casualty of a war between the United States and Iran would be the entire Saudi oil industry and therefore the Saudi royal family. And then all of a sudden, Saudi Arabia started acting more in line. I mean, Iran provided the deterrence. It's something I'm just realizing now that people should focus on a bit more, is that Iran's attacking of the I'm sorry, I did not pronounce that appropriately, attacking and destruction of disruption of 5% of Saudi Arabia's oil capacity. I think probably did more to make Saudi Arabia a sane, civilized, deterred actor on the world stage than anything that Donald Trump did for 3 or 4 years. So, I mean, it's at every step, Saudi Arabia working incredibly hard to destroy Iran, and Iran simply responds with missiles that illustrate quite clearly that it would be much easier to destroy Saudi Arabia than it would be to destroy Iran. And, Saudi becomes a saner actor. We haven't heard of many new crazy outrages from Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia since Iran sort of put them in their place with that attack on their refineries. The insane provocation of assassinating one of the top people in the Iranian government is responded to in a measured way. Israel's almost, I think, completely open and gleefully acknowledged assassination of a retired nuclear scientist in Iran in November was responded to by Iran by the insane, crazy Iranian parliament with a law that straightforwardly laid out the consequences for the Biden administration's delay of return to the JCPOA. I mean, the Iranians have shown themselves to be the adults in the room and have shown themselves to probably be, if not trustworthy, because we've done nothing to deserve trust either, but sensible users of power in the region. I think the Trump administration has been in sort of an audition for the Iranian regime to show whether they can act as responsible international actors, and they've proven that they can over and over and over again. Are they brutal and nasty to the people in their own countries? Of course, absolutely. But our attempt, our what we have to offer to countries in the region is illustrated by Iraq and Syria. I don't think that's much better than what the Iranian regime is offering right now. So yeah, it's just that just really strikes me. It's just the more that I think about it, it's just like the Iranians are the adults in the room here. The only question is whether the United States can get its shit together to engage with them positively and stop the death and destruction in the region. Not sure if I've made my points as well as I'd intended. I thought this was a real slam dunk of a presentation, but I'm not sure if I connected the dots quite the way that I did. Maybe just to make it clear, like why there are absolutely people in the Biden administration and were people in the Obama administration who are thinking along these lines. How do we get to the point where the United States can get out of the Middle East, but they can't make that case. They can't make the case, the obvious case to folks who know this, that the Middle East will be in vastly better shape without the U.S. presence. They can't make that case openly because there are so many actors in Washington, D.C. who are invested in that not being the case. And they don't want people to be thinking about the implications of how many defense company gravy trains will end if the JCPOA is actually tried and is successful. And as human beings, as citizens of the world, as Americans, as Iranians, as whatever, we should all desperately hope for the successful implementation of the JCPOA, but nothing is guaranteed, and that is not what Washington, D.C. wants. I hope this presentation was helpful. That was 40 minutes. That's sort of on the short side. So now it's time for me to start answering questions. Did I really run through all that in just 40 minutes? It's a brief one. Yeah. So I hope we got questions. Jack Hawkins, thank you so much for the super chat. I'm not seeing. Oh, that's interesting. Thank you so much for the super chat, Jack Hawkins. Do you have a question, Jack Hawkins? And that's weird. My chat wasn't going so quickly. Questions. Logo Cool Extreme asks, More Freedom Foundation, what would Iran have to do to piss you off so much that you support abandoning the JCPOA? I think, I don't know, like actually support a terror attack. I think that'd be like, yeah, if Iran did carried out some kind of terrorist attack in the United States, then obviously, if Iran carried out some kind of terror attack anywhere, that's the sort of the insane imbalance here is that Iran has been fighting international terrorism. Now, this wasn't necessarily true in the 80s and in the 1980s and the 1990s. In the 1980s and the 1990s, well, in the 1980s and the first half or so of the 1990s, the United States was funding Iraq in a murderous attack on Iran, in which 1 million people died. It's a war that I think folks say in the second half of the 20th century is most directly comparable to World War I. In that context, yes, in the 1980s, when Iran was a new revolutionary republic, and the United States and Saudi Arabia and an array of other wealthy countries bankrolled Iraq in its attempt to destroy Iran. Yes, Iran definitely was a state sponsor of terrorism and supported terrorist attacks against U.S. actors. I haven't seen any indication that they've done anything of that sort against the United States since 2001. I have never seen anything indicating that. So if Iran really did sort of in a provable way, get back into terrorism, then yeah, I would be against the JCPOA, I suppose. Though honestly, I mean, that would be an indication that maybe we would. Yeah, I don't know. So the thing is, like Iran's foreign policy has mostly been about keeping what we call terrorism has mostly been about keeping the United States, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia from giving Syria, a country of 20 million people, to jihadist lunatics. That's what the real stakes have been encountered. And Iranian support for terrorism is helping the Houthis, an indigenous resistance movement, throw out the Saudi imperialists and their puppets. Like that, you would have to actually show me Iran doing actual, like no joke, like anti-U.S. terrorism, like attacking innocent people, not just sort of effectively doing foreign policy by other means for real goals, which is what Iran has been doing. So yeah, I think that would do it. Petros Hulas says, I don't think that Reagan was supporting Iraq. It was simply selling weapons to Iraq. And Saddam Hussein was a lunatic attacking everybody, Robert. Don't blame the Iraq war on the USA, Robert. I've done some research on this. The United States actually did not sell many weapons to Iraq. It was actually, I think, largely sort of Soviet-based or what have you. However, after Saddam Hussein's big major attack against Iran that failed miserably, what happened was that it looked like Iraq was going to get quickly swallowed up by Iran. So by 1982, 1983, U.S. colonies like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, I don't know if the UAE and Qatar were quite as big a financial factor at that point yet, but they gave Iraq, and this is back when that was real money, over the course of that decade, $32 billion. The Iraqi war effort after its initial, this is a 10-year war from 1980 to 1989, I believe. After, say, 1981, 1982, it was completely unviable without the support of U.S. Gulf state colonies. So yeah, you can certainly make a case. Actually, no, that the United States didn't even, they sold, I think by the late 80s, the United States were selling attack helicopters to Iraq, but not in large numbers. However, U.S. Gulf colonies, all those sort of Gulf monarchies, paid entirely for Saddam Hussein's war effort for like 80% of the war. There was no doubt in any thinking person's mind at that point why the Iran-Iraq war was continuing. So that's nuanced, of course, but it's asserting that the United States was not on Iraq's side during the Iran-Iraq war may sound serious, but it's not. So Jack Hawkins asks, is the U.S. response to the attack on the Saudi Aramco oil processing facilities cutting on SA arms sales a real indicator of U.S. policy towards Iran? Is the U.S. response to the attack on the Saudi Aramco oil processing facilities cutting Saudi Arabia arms sales a real indicator of U.S. policy towards Iran? So those are two things that happened, 2 years apart. So I think the attack on the Abqaiq facility was it 2019? Was it 2018? I think it's 2019. And the cutting of Saudi Arabian arms sales is something that only happened now in the beginning of 2021 in the Biden administration. Something that Biden, so this is, keep in mind, this is what I was talking about, how everything that really matters in this region is a U.S. political issue. It's not, and the Biden administration, when it takes any action, has to be very careful to, hold the hand and assuage how do you pronounce assuage? The feelings of the war hawks in Washington, D.C. But also, I think it's a very real thing that the first thing I think that the Biden administration, one of their first official communications was a commitment to the defense of Saudi Arabia. And I think if anybody in Yemen, if there's anybody sensible with the Houthis in Yemen or with Iran, I think they now know that Biden is likely to take actions that are more friendly to Iran, like joining the JCPOA, finally ending Saudi Arabia's horrific invasion of Yemen. But they got to know, and I think Biden is actually saying very clearly that if attacks on Saudi Arabia proper, continue or accelerate, then that it's off the table. I think actually that might get to Loga's question, like if the Houthis, or Iran, I think at the time it wasn't particularly clear, but I think most people now believe that the 2019 attack that took out so much of the Saudi oil industry was almost certainly, the Houthis claimed it, but it was probably predominantly Iran. But yeah, if something else like that happened, then yeah, JCPOA is probably not going to happen. Of course, that makes it seem very likely, that it seems like it's in Saudi Arabia, or especially Israel's interest, to make something like that happen, like in sort of a false flag way. But that I do believe that with something as straightforward as missiles hitting oil production facilities, it's kind of a hard thing to fake. I believe. Don't quote me on that. So yeah, I do think that yeah, if the Houthis, took more than just, briefly border territory in Saudi Arabia's south, or if the severity of Houthi attacks stepped up dramatically and in such a way that could be attributable to Iran to the extent that the 2019 attacks were, then yeah, I think that would, I mean, it wouldn't make me anti-JCPOA, but I think it would dramatically impact the possibility of the JCPOA going back into force this year, which I think is still on balance. I think I'm actually quite hopeful about, and I think probably the growing consensus at this point is that it will happen this year. It could absolutely. There are a million things that could derail it, and there are tens of thousands of people in Washington D.C. working very hard at this moment to make sure that the JCPOA never happens. But I do think it's a possibility, strong possibility. So we'll see. Flash Gordon says Iran helps fund and supply Hezbollah, Hamas, and Syria, enemies of Israel who are allied with the United States. Yes, but Hezbollah and Hamas do things that are sort of terrorist activities, but they also, are somewhat legally constituted governments of hundreds of thousands to millions of people. So I don't know. That's not the sort of terrorism that particularly concerns me. The sort of random knockdown World Trade Center mass death for fun terrorism that it's usually Sunnis, Saudis, the United States, and the UAE sponsoring. That stuff tends to bother me more. Because my understanding, I mean, Hezbollah and Israel, I've read stuff. I think Gilad talks about it a little bit. I mean, Hezbollah and Israel are sort of that they've sort of effectively deterred each other to a degree. I mean, I don't. My understanding is there's not much violence left on that border at all, which is sort of an indicator. Like as Hezbollah becomes, more serious political actor, which is something we should, we shouldn't try to assassinate every Hezbollah person. We should, actually encourage them to become a more real political actor, because as it becomes a more real political actor, it becomes less violent. I mean, that's one indication, one possibility. I'm not going to die on that hill at this moment, but it's a suspicion that I have. Meltemeyer says they tried to blow up a diaspora group in France. France got to them before they got the chance. Did they, though? I remember in particular the one claim that I looked into was that they had tried desperately that there was a plot, because we get this a lot, most often revealed by, Saudi or Israeli intelligence services that, oh no, there was this massive, massive, massive Iranian terror plot. We swear. Oh, you want details of this massive, massive Iranian terror plot? Well, we can't really give you the details because that would give up our sources and methods. So you just have to really believe us here, in the United States intelligence community that there was totally this big nasty plot by the Iranians. So when you sort of dive in, there's a lot of plots that were supposedly foiled, or there's not a lot of there. I'd like to see actual things that they did, deaths, before I would get particularly convinced that there's a real Iranian terror threat. Seiko TV says, I like how you call those small Gulf countries as U.S. colonies. I mean, that's what they are. Fido says, if the Saudis hadn't messed Egypt so much, Egypt would be a greater country balanced around. That is a point I wanted to make. This is something that sort of struck me here. I have been completely nonplussed by, I've made a number of videos about the Abraham Accords, the Trump administration's efforts to get Israel and Arab countries on the same page, and I've been quite dismissive of them. Though I did make a video about the Sudan-Israel deal, how I found it disturbing in some ways, but how if it worked, it would be just a revolution in Middle East affairs. And sort of thinking about like what the Trump administration was trying to do in Israel, and I don't want to give them more credit than they deserve. Sorry, what they were trying to do with the Abraham Accords in the Middle East more broadly. I don't want to give them more credit than they deserve, but it did strike me as I was prepping for this video, like there's an aspect of it that's kind of brilliant. So as I read about the Middle East, as I read about more and more about the Arab nationalist struggle, this sort of thing, I feel more and more guilty about what my expectations are of the Middle East when the United States finally butts the fuck out. My my assumption has long been that it'll go back to what it was before World War One, which is essentially the region divided between Turkey and Iran. No problem for me. Kind of sad for the Arabs because, of course, from depending on how you measure it, the actual Arabs haven't, despite building this extraordinary world-spanning empire in the 700s or so, the Arabs themselves haven't had much agency in that region really since the Turks showed up. Debatably, depending on which regime or which dynasty or whatnot, since the Turks showed up 1,000 years ago. I care about self-determination and freedom and things like that. And it's always really bugged me that it's like, well, my expectation of the Middle East is that, the Arab countries have been such basket cases since independence that it really looks quite straightforward that it's just going to be sort of a return to sort of Turkish and Persian. It's going to be this brief, the whole Western incursion will be this brief, really quite brief, only century long from 1920s to 2020s. This sort of brief incursion in between a millennia of Persian and Turkic domination of the Arab world, and that's always made me kind of sad, frankly. There are exciting and interesting stories of Arab nationalism and independence and struggle, and it just seemed kind of grim that yes, largely because of the way that Egypt has just completely played itself, that there just didn't really seem like there was much of a much real Arab power there. And I think I don't even know if they were smart enough to be contemplating this, but it's actually kind of an extraordinary thing that the Trump administration was attempting, this recognition that Israel and the Arabs, writ more broadly, which I don't really believe is fair to do anymore at this point. I think pan-Arabism and Arab nationalism is kind of long dead. But the tantalizing possibility that the Trump administration was inadequately working towards would be that these two actors, Israel and the Arab world, that both have sort of half of what you need to be a real world power, this idea that they could unite to balance against the Turks and the Iranians. And I think that's actually an exciting geopolitical prospect. That's something that actually sounds worthwhile and worth doing. So, I mean, Israel obviously has the blessing of being sort of the 51st U.S. state, the incredibly educated population, high tech, high human capital, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Israel's got all that. But it's just so fucking small, it's just tiny. So in that sense, it's got all of these elements that it needs to be a world power, and none of the people. And then you've got the Arab world, from Morocco through to Palestine and up into modern Turkey almost. You got the Arab world, it's got 400 million people. I mean, God, that's bigger than the United States. So you've got with the Arab world and with Israel, you've both got sort of half a world power there. If they could ever get to the point where they could legitimately work together, then you have got a real, like no shit, real world power. So that's a tantalizing, almost science fiction prospect that to some degree the Trump administration was attempting to bring about. Of course, they were doing so in like the worst way possible. Like, I mean, I'm sorry, like there are elements of the protestation that Israel is a democracy that are inaccurate. If you've got 5 million people without the vote and without control of their land and futures. Well, that's not quite a democracy, but Israel itself has incredibly vibrant democratic institutions, and I think they undermine them by their willingness to work with the quite foul groups that are almost certainly going to be bankrolling the Trump family's retirement. I'm talking about the Saudi royal family. I'm talking about the UAE's various collections of royal families and elites. I think it is a legitimately, Jared Kushner was not wrong in thinking, if he was thinking this far, that the prospect of a united Judeo-Arabic front is kind of an extraordinarily promising one, and one that people like me who are concerned about the idea of Arabs, all 400 million Arabs getting subjugated again by Turks and Iranians is I think a legitimate concern. The problem is that the toolbox that the Trump administration, sort of under the auspices of the U.S. defense industry, are choosing to build that prospect with, is just fundamentally illegitimizing. It just doesn't. They're just. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of people in the Arab world who want to believe that Israel is vulnerable. I don't believe that. But the Saudi royal family. I mean, these are, as I'm constantly saying, these are not people that are going to be in power 10 years from now. And the deals and the accommodations that they make will all be fundamentally illegitimized. So there's a real risk here of I think there are elements within Israel that are really trying to build this idea of like, okay, this sort of Judeo-Arabic. I mean, would that be like a united Semitic front against the Turks and the Persians? Have this real risk of waking up after another Arab Spring type development 5 to 10 years now, and being back at 1948, surrounded by all these countries that hate them even more than they did, because Israelis are seen as the folks propping up dictators like Sisi and MBS and MBZ and all them. So yeah, that was a lot of bloviating. I hope that made sense. Questions? Did I miss any super chats? I do tend to answer more questions with super chats attached to them, but it looks like I did not. No Brando Commando this week. Anyway, okay, questions. Michael Dobbs says, when did Iranians subjugate the Arabs that made you so concerned and happy to see Arabs and Israelis get together, albeit for all the wrong reasons? So it's fascinating. If you've ever spent time reading about the history of the Middle East, it is extraordinary how shot through with just the way that all of these things have rolled together. I think the Ottoman Empire and a variety of other dynasties, the folks that who have controlled the Middle East for 1,000 years, were, I think, generically speaking, to the extent that this makes sense, were of Turkic stock. They were, and this actually goes all the way to India, basically. Sort of Turkic extraction, more or less, attributable to sort of one tribe over from the Mongols in Central Asia. These folks have ruled the Middle East to some extent. Of course, what that actually means and how directly you can connect that to modern Turkey, you can't really, because it's a completely different entities. But what's crazy about these Turkic peoples that have ruled the Middle East from actually, I think Morocco has more of a history of obviously has history of independence from the Ottoman Empire, but it was never conquered by the Ottoman Empire. But even before that, I think it was more Berber and Arab folks who would always run Morocco. But other than Morocco, pretty much from Algeria all the way to fucking Bangladesh, the ruling class for 1,000 years was Turkic, but they spoke Persian. So it's just this incredible where you draw the lines with each particular dynasty, or my understanding is that for a lot of the Ottoman Empire, I'm not 100% about this. I think Persian was a courtly language for the Ottoman Empire to some extent. Ottoman, of course, is famously a mishmash of Arabic, Persian, the Turkic of the steppes, all sort of smashed together. After the language reform in the 1920s, you actually can't. The crazy thing about Turkish is modern Turkish only goes back to the 1920s. If you want to be a serious historian of the Ottoman Empire, you don't just have to learn a new script because they had the Arabic script before the 1920s. You have to learn a completely different dead language that's this weird amalgam of Persian, Turkic, and Arabic. So does that answer your question? It's that the Abbasid Empire, my understanding, was seen as highly Persian influenced. I think the Persians are classically seen as one of the classic examples. The Chinese, of course, are probably the biggest ones, where waves of conquerors would conquer them and then be conquered by the Persian language and Persian culture. And then, of course, eventually leading to Persian-speaking dynasties that controlled Arabic lands. So obviously, post modern technology, modern military affairs, modern ideas of nationalism, most importantly, this idea that the Iranian people and the Turkish people are much more separate and monolithic and, well, frankly, literate in a mass way, in ways that were never possible 150 years ago. Obviously leads to different things, but I think it seems quite likely to me that even in this new world, if the Arabs remain, the multiple Arab countries remain as just uncapable as they have been, then Iran and Turkey will sort of slice things up for their own benefit. Also competing with great powers like Russia and France, as we're seeing in Libya. I hope did that answer that question, I hope? Local Cool Extreme says Brent is stabilizing at $60. How is that happening with Trump helping the Saudis? This is Brent crude prices, oil prices. This is very straightforward. The Saudis, I think a couple months back, in an effort to shore up OPEC production cuts as oil producing petroleum exporting countries. In an effort, Saudi Arabia was having trouble a couple months back getting people to commit to continuing the cutback in production that OPEC had to do to get prices to not be negative back in March. And Saudi Arabia said, "Fuck it, we can't convince you guys to curtail." So Saudi Arabia itself took 1 million barrels off of the market, and that'll have an impact. What we're also seeing is that the shale industry in the United States has almost entirely shut itself down. It's now coming back, of course, as we head towards $60 a barrel, and it's we'll go a little bit higher, and then we'll start going back down again, depending on how much more money shale producers can get out of Wall Street. The fact is that they can't get that much money out of Wall Street anymore, as we've discussed many times on this channel. So what was I going to say? So yeah, I mean, this is quite expected. Oil prices going up a little bit more. I think a lot of folks will, it was the Keystone XL, but I don't really quite buy that. There's a lot more to world oil markets than just that. Of course, if it were ever to be a real concern that oil prices were getting, I would get, I don't want to fall into making forecasts at this point, but if we were to get to a point where oil prices were a real concern, well, then we could just sign the JCPOA and start buying. Jump back into the JCPOA and start buying Iranian oil again. The Trump administration, as I've talked about, was basically, Donald Trump was the first OPEC president. I think a lot of his pitch, to even a higher degree than most Republicans, was about preserving the fossil fuel industry and how great coal and gas and oil were. So he actually actively constrained the world oil production by screwing up Libya, taking there's 1 million barrels there, by straight up embargoing Venezuela. That was 2 million barrels there. And most importantly, knocking, I think Iran was getting back up to 4 million barrels of oil in production before Trump, before Trump jumped out of the JCPOA and started sanctioning countries that bought Iranian oil again. So that's like 4 million barrels right there. So one of the reasons that oil prices started getting back up into more normal ranges was Saudi Arabia is taking 1 million barrels of oil off the market. Trump took conservatively 6 or 7 million barrels off the market. And those policies continue. Joe Biden can really only do so many things at once. He's got all kinds of political constraints on how much he can do to undo that damage. I think Libya is probably the easiest one. And Libyan production is already shooting up, and it looks like there's a ceasefire and interim government process that's proceeding over there. So that's 1 million barrels right there. Venezuela is a really, really difficult one, especially because even at $60 a barrel, Venezuela's fucked up oil industry, and really not that great oil even before that, isn't quite viable yet either. So these things are differing levels of difficulty. So we're still operating in the world that Trump made with 6 or 7 million barrels of oil a day booted off the market, and with Saudi Arabia adding one more taken off, and shale industry running out of runway with Wall Street, it makes sense that prices start going up. What's going to be fascinating is watching those prices develop. It's funny because before COVID and before oil prices just went straight down to the toilet for about 8 months. Straight down to the toilet for about 8 months. I had really just stopped checking oil prices, which is one of my favorite things to do. So it's going to be fascinating to watch in the coming months how all of these dynamics interact. There's, shale will become more viable if oil, Brent and WTI make it further into the mid 60s. You don't need, the best shale plays in the United States don't need all that Wall Street financing to be profitable. They just need prices to be in the mid 60s. So yeah, some of that'll come back on stream. If that fails to bring prices down, then all of a sudden electric cars, which are a rapidly growing market, become more attractive. So like, how are all these dynamics going to interact with each other? Who knows? Well, what if Algeria falls into greater political instability and their oil and gas production start getting impacted? Then maybe we're actually to a point where one of the most extraordinary things for the past 6 years is that actions that would have led to price spikes, up into the $100 a barrel range. Any one of the geopolitical things that I just mentioned, something going wrong in one country, like in Nigeria or Libya, any one of those things would have put prices into the stratosphere. For the past 6 years, we've been to a point where like multiple geopolitical events can happen at one time, and the oil price just keeps limping along at $40 or $50. With the constraints that I've just been probably talking about for too long right now, are we now in a position where, like, when a new geopolitical thing comes up, we do get a big price spike? And if we do get that big price spike, do we immediately see that month's electric vehicle sales going through the roof? I mean, it's fascinating stuff, which I'm eager to watch a little more carefully. Fadel asks, Egypt has all, with a super chat, thank you, sir. Egypt has all the ingredients to be arguably the biggest player in the Middle East. It has the biggest population, and it's placed incredibly strategically. Yes, 100%. This is one of the great great mysteries and great just sort of shocks of geopolitical history. It's in the 1950s when Egypt finally attained its sort of more formal, more complete independence from from Britain, it was just sort of assumed that Egypt would, bestride the southern Mediterranean like a colossus, that it was going to be tremendously important. I mean, Egypt's got 100 million people now, and it's surrounded. Every country around it is smaller. It's big rival that shares a border with Egypt, 7 million people. Um, it's got the Suez Canal. It's got the Nile, a historic source of incredible um, economic and cultural wealth and heritage. And yeah, it's just been a complete fucking clusterfuck for coming up on Jesus, coming up on 70 years now. And there's a disaster that comprehensive isn't down to any one cause. And it's something I definitely want to read more about. I did a sort of series about the beginnings of the modern Egyptian state, a sort of mini series, a couple of videos at the beginning of last year. Jesus, time goes so quickly. And I'd love to follow up with that, especially because I'm sort of getting a little less leery of talking about Israel, and you can't really talk about Egypt's failure without talking about Israel. However, I do not want if Egypt, a country of 100 million, couldn't get its shit together because of the minor political machinations of a neighbor of 7 million, well, that's an indication that there was a hell of a lot more wrong with Egypt than Israel itself. I don't want to get into sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theorizing. One aspect of Egypt's extraordinary failure is its relationship with Israel. There's a lot more to it, and it's just fascinating stuff to get into. I mean, the Egyptian military, which is was the tool of Egyptian independence and Egyptian self-determination and freedom before the British took over, has just been extraordinarily malign. I haven't done enough study on modern Egypt to really be able to speak more intelligently about that. But Fadl's absolutely right, and just like, how did this country go so wrong? Because Egypt, around 100 years ago, Egypt was the acknowledged sort of leader of the Arab world. It was the big deal. One of the more fascinating and less covered aspects of the Cold War and sort of 20th century history is what's called the Arab Cold War, which pitted Egypt against Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia had billions of dollars of oil wealth and the United States in its corner. So that is a conflict that Egypt lost. Specifically, Yemen was tremendously important with that, a conflict in the 1960s that was sort of seen latterly as Egypt's Vietnam, that had a lot more serious consequences for Egypt than Vietnam ended up having for the United States. Anyway, I'm not sure those thoughts are particularly well organized or expressed, so I will move on from Egypt. I hope, Fadel, that what I said there had was worthy of your generosity with that super chat. Maltemeyer says, when Erdogan changes course, the Arab world will have more time to not worry about Turkey power over the region. I'm not sure, honestly. I think there's a distinct chance, and I hope very much that Erdogan will become less militarily involved in Syria. But I think the era of Turkey just sort of keeping its nose out of the Middle East and letting the United States do whatever it wants, I think that's over under any Turkish government coming up, because Turkey is a real power to an extent that it wasn't really during the Cold War. I mean, it had real military power, but it was much more closely aligned with U.S. interests and didn't have what's the word? I'm not expressing this well. There was so little daylight between U.S. and Turkish positions, and a lack of real Turkish interest in the Middle East. Erdogan has put forward, and people before Erdogan have, you sort of starting with this was Turgut Özal. It was the big sort of liberate the Turkish economy, pro-capitalist, pro-business Turkey guy in the 1980s, and that's a heritage that Erdogan is very much a part of, or at least was initially. And Turkish businessmen are gonna continue to have interests everywhere, and those interests will be backed more enthusiastically by the Turkish military. Hopefully, we're not going to see anything as outsized as the past 4 years of Turkey's sort of ever escalating Cold War with Russia, rampaging through Syria, Libya, and Armenia and Azerbaijan. I mean, hopefully we won't be seeing anything that dramatic anymore. But I think Turkey has very much stepped out on the world stage in a way that will look less dramatic, but will not become less present. That's my thinking anyway. Flash Gordon says Iran attacking Saudi's oil industry and the entire Iranian Saudi oil scenario is a global contrivance to control oil prices and trade weapons and technologies. Yeah, I just talked about how Donald Trump was the OPEC president, and the only discernible goal of his foreign policy was driving up oil prices. But I don't know what the broader conspiracy you're talking about is. I think we're in a position now where we're going to see oil. We're already seeing oil becoming a dramatically less important facet of geopolitics. And oh boy, that's great. Abdul Rehman says, I don't think Turks are pretty fond of seeing their soldiers get killed in foreign wars. How are they going to rule over Arabia? I mean, how does the United States rule over most of the world? It's economic investment, and it is the threat of the use of power. It's not like I mean, who knows what the world's going to look like when the U.S. decline of relative power has gone for another 50 years. I'm not saying that everybody's more naturally getting happier with empires. I mean, the United States is getting more eager to endorse empires. I mean, that's what the United Arab Emirates has been doing in Yemen, has been carving out quite straightforwardly 19th century imperial spheres of influence within Yemen, and just sort of basically running off with islands that are part of Yemen proper. I think we're going to see more of that direct stuff, but we're also going to see more power exerted by Turkey or Iran, making it clear to a Libya, or unfortunately a Tunisia, or maybe even as big as an Algeria. Well, I think Algeria is probably has independent power geographically and just being farther enough away, but a Jordan or an Oman, being told that, look, if you don't do what we want, then you're going to become a protectorate like Libya. And that's so, yeah, it's of course, no public is going to be okay with deaths of, mass deaths of their soldiers. But we're already reaching a world, the United States is already there, where we're running 6 or 7 wars where the US soldier is basically just there as bait for, Iran escalation. It's all robots and missiles, and Turkey's actually a leader in that as well. It was Turkish and Israeli drones that won Azerbaijan all its territory back in that war last fall. And Turkey is a leader in drone technology as well. In Syria, Turkey has very serious commitment of Turkish troops, but none in Azerbaijan, very little in Libya. So yeah, that's one of the huge factors of war this decade, is that geopolitical actors, not even the big boys, but also sort of mid-range fellas like Turkey, don't even need to have soldiers on the ground anymore. Mehmet Rasim Inceoğlu says, what do you think about the U.S. condemning the PKK execution of 13 unarmed people under the condition that they have to be sure first that it was the PKK? Not familiar with that particular story. I'm not familiar with that particular question, so I can't speak to that. I'm sorry. Sounds grim, whatever it was. AA says, you never talk about cryptocurrencies. How will adoption lead to political changes? For example, sanction circumvention, mostly because I don't believe in it. I've been surprised, especially on this, this particular Bitcoin peak. I talk about this a lot. I feel like it's a question that comes up often, so I talk about it a lot on the patrons only newscast. If you guys are enjoying this presentation, you can sign up on Patreon in the link below, because every month I do a monthly newscast where I address everything that the patrons want me to talk about. It's usually only 4 or 5 people who show up for the live thing. So it's more of a conversation. And then patrons, about 50, 60 people usually watch the newscast or listen to it as they clean their house or whatever later on. And they suggest all the topics. So if there's a topic that you think I should talk about more in depth, well, sign up as a Patreon and it'll come up on the patrons live newscast. I try to cover as everything that people want to talk in those 2-hour presentations rather than focusing on one big one and whatever questions come up with the super chats in this one. So you should sign up on Patreon if you think I'm neglecting something. But yeah, in cryptocurrencies in particular, I've been surprised and honestly a little pissed at just how much more buy-in they've been getting this time around. I suppose pissed at myself because I missed out on a lot of money. I've been aware of Bitcoin since I think 2009, Hacker News and whatnot, and I considered signing up. And I looked at it, I was like, oh, this is kind of complicated. And those $100 those 100 Bitcoins that I considered buying for less than $100 in 2009 would be that's what, like $4 million now? No, 400,000. No, $4 million now. So I wish I'd done that. But the thing that has always bugged me with Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies more broadly is that the promises of disruption and change that their value is based on require levels of disruption and change that I never believed that already established fiat currencies with militaries attached would accept and allow. And I still don't believe that they will. If, Bitcoin is to have this revolutionary potential, ending the dollar, well, then the dollar will make sure that doesn't happen. And that's always been my take on cryptocurrencies. I think there's, of course, amazing technological capability. It's, really interesting technology, this, that, and the other thing, yada fucking yada. But as far as really the revolutionary change that's promised, I've never really bought it, which of course has meant that I've never bought Bitcoin and I've missed out on a lot of money. It's a pity. Anyway, that's what I have to say about cryptocurrencies. Petro Hula Hula says, oh no, AY says, Petro was, like I said earlier, you're a bloodthirsty racist who wants to go to war. Go enlist or shut up. Well, geez, that seems negative. Biden lied. He won't withdraw from Afghanistan. Yeah, I think Petros Huluhus is right. I don't see Biden withdrawing from Afghanistan, which is a real fucking shame. But I do see a potential for the end of the war in Yemen and a broader regularization with Iran, which is honestly would be an amazing accomplishment for a U.S. president. But yeah, I think we're in Afghanistan forever, which sucks. Fadel says, should having a strong Egyptian ally be a priority for the United States? Yes, absolutely. A strong Egyptian ally would be great. But I think what we also need to focus on is a strong, and this is something that Israel also needs to focus on, is having strong, worthwhile allies. Because when I see Sisi, when I look at Sisi, and I know that Netanyahu and Trump and the U.S. government more broadly, and the Israeli government less broadly, because they're generally smarter people, are extraordinarily invested in Sisi and his leadership of Egypt. And whenever I look at Sisi, I just see the Shah of Iran circa 1975. This guy is very much in power, but he's in power because of an extraordinary amount of bloodshed. He's in power because he's made Egypt an extraordinarily miserable place to live. For anybody who has independent thoughts of any kind. I mean, Egypt's been a dictatorship for, all except a year and a half interval in around 2012, 2013. But it's been a happier dictatorship than it is now. So yeah, I see Sisi as pretty vulnerable and not somebody to invest in more heavily. So yeah, but obviously, yeah, Egypt's a country of 100 million people with all of that potential agricultural wealth and cultural wealth, and yeah, it's a tremendously disappointing thing. But it does not do better than it does. Petros Huluhulus says, funny that Robert does not cover the most important issue of our times, COVID-19, at all. I was very clear about this from the beginning, Petros. I don't have expertise in medicine or public health, and I see a shit ton of people pretending that their opinions have merit without that relevant expertise. I'm happy to talk about political and economic ramifications of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think I do that, at least elliptically, a lot. But yeah, what am I supposed to come up and talk to you about? masks and vaccines and all manner of shit I have no understanding of? No, I'll leave that for Fox News. Yeah, I think there's a lot of idiocy and misinterpretation and whatnot out there, and I don't particularly want to add to it, and I don't have the expertise to do anything other than add to it. So yeah, I don't talk about COVID-19 much. Ali Razi asks, what big topic won your poll? The big topic that won my poll, the topic that I'll be covering with my next big project, I think probably at this point with a book and with a series of videos, will be U.S. Empire, which is more or less direct follow-up to my book, Avoiding the British Empire, which was sort of a stealth history of the world over the past 250 years, starting in the 1750s and ending around World War I. My sort of history of U.S. empire would be going from World War I to the present. And mostly, I think this time around, I think it's going to be a shorter book for sure. I think just sort of an overview, because I think a lot of folks aren't really aware how this sort of political entity, the U.S. empire, U.S. world system, has functioned. It's something that's actually reaching the century mark. It's about 100 years old, and I think it'd be interesting to find a clever way to talk about it. And yeah, that's what folks voted for. I was a bit surprised. I had honestly assumed when I set up this competition to see what my next big topic would be, I had assumed that folks were going to go with Israel Palestine. I've already got a bookshelf of books I've been accumulating over a couple years, biographies of most Israeli prime ministers, etc., because I was assuming that was what you guys were going to vote for. And then there was the other option, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, that was doing very well for a while. But then I did the U.S. Empire video, and then U.S. Empire choice sort of shot out in front. I was surprised, but I'm very happy to do it. I think that it allowed me to do a lot of research that I need to do on the Cold War. But instead of putting together quite as thick and boring a tome as Avoiding the British Empire, I think I want to do something a little more light and breezy with it before I use that research to expand the next edition of Avoiding the British Empire at some point in the mid to late 2020s. So yeah, those are the plans. Ali Razi asks, can Iran become a U.S. ally, let's say, in 20, 30 years? Man, Iran was a U.S. ally in 2014 and 2015. The most important U.S. ally in fighting the Islamic State was Iran. I talked about how sort of the Trump administration, specifically his assassination of Soleimani, sort of represented the end of the second great opportunity in Iranian-U.S. relations. Obviously, Iranian-U.S. relations got off to a pretty nasty start in 1979 with the hostage crisis and the Shah that the U.S. had supported for so long being overthrown and then protected by the United States. Yeah, pretty nasty start. The first great opportunity there was actually 9/11. 9/11 was, of course, executed primarily by Saudi Arabians and primarily with Saudi money and by an organization led by Saudi Arabians and in pursuit of a broadly Saudi Arabian ideology. Saudi Arabia and Iran had been geopolitical rivals from the jump, from the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Iran was very eager to help the United States pursue Sunni jihadists in Afghanistan, pursue Al Qaeda, provided very valuable intelligence, and then George W. Bush fucking declared war against them in the Axis of Evil speech in it was early 2002. So that was the first opportunity squandered. The second opportunity was the Islamic State. It was again another Sunni. What's the word I'm looking for? A Sunni jihadist organization that the United States and Saudi Arabia and a number of other Gulfies and Turkey as well had all sort of colluded to attack Assad. That got out of hand a little bit. And again, Iran was the most threatened by the Islamic State and the most interested in fighting with it. And there absolutely was on the ground cooperation between the U.S. military and the Iranian military. I really hope we don't get another fucking opportunity like 9/11 or the Islamic State, because those are both horrible things to have happened. But yeah, there's no real reason for Iran and the United States to be in conflict. I think that people assume that Iran has some horrible fucking mat-on for Israel. No, they don't. They have a horrible fucking mat-on for the United States that keeps fucking with them. Israel is just it's a limb of the United States. They're the little Satan, and the United States is the great Satan in the famous Iranian revolutionary terminology. So, yeah, I don't think there's much standing in between U.S. and Iranian alliance, other than an alliance between Iranian hardliners and U.S. hardliners. Countries have a lot in common. It's one of the most democratically oriented countries in the region. I think that whenever the United States backs off of Iran, even slightly, the nastier hardliner elements of Iran lose. They lose big. Google the Green Movement. Okay. Fado says, are you going to talk about your favorite president, Woodrow Wilson, in your upcoming book? Yeah, no question. Obviously, I hate Woodrow Wilson, as we all know. And I don't hate him. I try not to hate anybody. But I think that Woodrow Wilson was a truly terrible president who sort of made the world what it was. Guy got elected to keep us out of World War I and ended up inventing the income tax and bringing about Adolf Hitler. So yeah, fuck that guy. But yeah, I think I'm sure Woodrow Wilson will come up. There's no question. You can't talk about the past 100 years of U.S. empire without talking about Woodrow Wilson. As to exactly the format that the book will take, and like these are all things that are very up in the air and unformed at this moment. Petros Huhulis says, news media have to make charts of who fights whom in Syria and Iraq in the past, just to make sense. They should, honestly. That's a very good point, Petros. It's a goddamn mess. Mr. Ma, 2007, says, as a Syrian, I don't have a country anymore. What should I do? Well, that's a terrible question, and I'm sorry. No, it's a very good question. But it indicates a terrible situation, and I'm sorry for what my country has done to you. I don't know. I mean, it's how could I speak to that? As someone who's been privileged to live in the United States and also be among the more privileged classes in the United States. I can't even imagine the idea of not having access to my home or my home country. I certainly critique the United States all the time, but that comes from a place of extreme security in the United States, and a wish that I could make it better, but it's something that I have great confidence in. And as a Syrian, I could see that diminishing. I absolutely believe that the United States, Saudi Arabia, Turkey to be the folks who destroyed Syria, but that doesn't mean I don't make the mistake that some do of assuming that Assad is somehow a positive or laudable actor. He's not. He's a dictator that we should have bribed out of office. It's the most effective strategy to dealing with murderous dictators across Asia, Europe, and Latin America in my lifetime. It's very clearly should been shown to be not some militarized nightmare, the militarized nightmare that the United States worked very hard to build in Syria, but quite simply allowing neoliberalism to work its ways and make it worth these dictators' time to leave, and that's what's worked throughout the world in literally dozens of countries just in my lifetime. And it is to the eternal shame of the United States and the international community that we chose not to do that in Syria. And I can only hope, Mr. Ma, that you are able to make do wherever you've landed and make that your country, or perhaps strengthen yourself and your ability to help rebuild Syria whenever that becomes an option, whenever the United States allows that to start. Yeah, Abdul Rahman says the United States wasn't fighting alongside bin Laden. They were indirectly funding them. Who got how much was decided by Pakistan. That's not true. There's a number of operations and whatnot. At the very top of the U.S. government, we were well aware that we were supporting jihadism. It was a conscious. You've got quotes of, got his unpronounceable name, Zbigniew Brzezinski, a guy who was in the upper realms of the Carter and Reagan administrations. That can't be right. I mean, it is completely an acknowledged fact that the United States eagerly supported Sunni jihadism as a tool against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan and throughout the stands and I think even the Caucasus. That's not a questioned thing. That's an established historical fact, and I don't think it was even the wrong thing to do necessarily. The Soviet Union was bad. I'm glad we undermined them and that it no longer exists. But yeah, there's no real question that Osama bin Laden was a creature of the United States, and the United States foreign policy, as is everything about Saudi Arabia. Petros Huhulis says Osama bin Laden never accepted any money from America. He had enough money and too much pride to align himself with the devil. Yeah, okay. Where does Saudi money come from? The Saudi system is completely untenable without U.S. protection. That has always been the case. And there were elements within the U.S. government, I think actually some quite publicly, that supported conservative Islam, which is what we called it in the 80s, and then radical Islamic terrorism is what we called it in the aughts. Anyway. Taz Canoa says, also sorry, as a New Jerseyan, we didn't mean to create that monster in the United States. I don't think, was Woodrow Wilson from New Jersey? I think he was certainly had his career in New Jersey. I thought he had sort of southern descent. Questions. Any chance you would do Twitch? I think you make interesting contribution in the Twitch politics. I don't even know what Twitch is, I'm afraid. But yeah, I'm in Puerto Rico right now, sort of visiting my sister, and sort of painting up there. If you can see that, painting of her up there anyway. I hopefully, it's not 100% yet, but I hope in early March to be moving into an apartment of my own where I will actually be able to, thanks to the patrons, I'm moving into an apartment of my own where I will be able to really buckle down and focus on doing what I can to grow this incredible platform you guys have been kind enough to give me. Sort of, many have noticed that it's been quite, after sort of years of sort of steady growth, we've sort of plateaued instead of, spiking again, which is what I would like. So I'm gonna look into a lot of things, and maybe Twitch will be one of the things that I look into. Loga, you want to explain to me what Twitch is at some point? Anyway, I've never really understood the Twitch, but yeah, I intend to do a lot more collaborations, a lot more More social media platforms and just churn more stuff out there because um, as delighted as I was with the success of the fundraising thing in December, like there's just not the channel is not growing, and I do not like that. Anyway. Waleed Saeed says, you say Saudi Arabia, USA, Turkey created ISIS. Of course I do. That's really straightforward. Anyway. Bellerophon was wondering how come you look like it's summer there. I hope you're having a good time. I am having a good time in Puerto Rico. It's quite nice down here. It's too hot, frankly. But I think I've timed it quite well. I'll be returning to the United States around, what's the word I'm looking for? I am in the United States. Apologies, that was incorrect. Puerto Rico is the United States. It is not a state. It is a Commonwealth of Puerto Rico that is affiliated with the United States in ways that are confusing. But when I return to the mainland United States, the weather should start improving almost when I start landing, which is exciting. But down here, it's a little hotter than I'd like. Petros Houloulis is just trying to piss me off by saying, ironically, ISIS was created by the withdrawal of the USA from Iraq and Turkey stopping the war to flow to Iraq, which is just horseshit. I have a video called Everybody's Lying About the Islamic State. I think it's one of the best videos I've ever done. And it explains how that myth that Petros Houloulis was pointing out was pushing, this idea that, oh, ISIS came about because the United States left Iraq, is actually completely backwards. U.S. policy was the creation of a big open space in northern Syria filled with jihadists. If U.S. soldiers had been in Iraq, we probably would have more efficiently created ISIS in northern Syria. So anyway. Questions. Oh, Bellerophon says, I think you can stream in both platforms simultaneously. Yeah, I need to know. I need to know more about technology. I need to do more about that sort of thing. Multimeyer says, just say colony. Okay, I'll say colony. Oh, you mean for Puerto Rico? I would not say colony. I would not just say colony for Puerto Rico. It's funny. I made a video about Puerto Rico this time around last year, and I am very, very interested as someone who is, a United States patriot, but in the long term, not the short term stupid way. I am very interested in doing whatever Puerto Ricans want us to do with Puerto Rico and treat them however they want to be treated. It is in the U.S. interest to maintain Puerto Rico within the United States in whatever way that's possible. Flash Gordon says, perhaps you should debate against people on modern day debate. They recently had some good debates on socialism versus capitalism. Are you a socialist? I think I'm kind of against sort of dumbass diarchies. This sort of socialism or capitalism. I think that appeals to people who don't know much about either. I think that the world is a lot more complicated than I'm not a socialist or it's not either or. I think a better system is one where any system is one where the general elements or drives that I think you're intending to point to with capitalism or socialism, all systems have both. And yeah, do I think we could benefit in some respects from going a little more leftward, going back towards FDR and the New Deal a little? Yeah, I do actually. I wouldn't say that makes me a socialist, but perhaps you would. MAM says Biden is a two-faced scumbag. Yes, obviously. Anybody who runs for president is a multiple-faced scumbag. You've got to be a sociopath to want to be president. Join Kingher says, channels that speak truth will not grow in these times. Usually I'd agree with you, but I find that that's actually not the case. I think there are some really basic things I need to do. I think I should probably buy a better camera, but I think my videos just need to be longer. And that's definitely something that's going to happen more consistently in the coming months. That's a really key aspect. They need to be longer and more frequent. And that's my goal. Petros says, ISIS was created with Arab money, Robert, not by... What the fuck do you think Arab money is? What do you think these fucking Gulf countries are, dude? Like, They are U.S. protectorate / colonies. The only reason that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, any of these places exist is because they were set up and protected by the British Empire, and then they were handed to the United States almost entirely, without any change in the 1970s. These places exist and are wealthy and do things in foreign policy because we let them, because we allow them and protect them as they do so. There is no distinction between Gulfy foreign policy and U.S. foreign policy. It's ours. We own it. I'm sorry. I just get a little testy at folks who don't acknowledge that. What? And Petros is maintaining that they fought to liberate themselves, which is just utter horseshit, and betrays complete ignorance of what has gone on. Saudi Arabia did win some of its territory by military power. None of the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait did. So, there. Anyway. Yes, Marty Biggs points out I need a better camera, and I agree. Tells Kid Noah, do you think U.S. would allow indigenous-centric state governments? That's a very interesting question. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, Utah sort of run by a minority. That's I think it's interesting. Every state is to some degree run by local power centers, and I think the Constitution envisions that it be so. And I think you're absolutely right. I was having a fascinating question on Puerto Rican statehood. The fact is that in most places that attained statehood in U.S. history, they did so when a critical mass of white people showed up and disowned whoever the indigenous groups were. That's very much the deal with Hawaii, which my understanding is still to some extent is largely owned and run by a handful of white families that sort of led the colonization of the place in the latter 19th century. That's not going to be what happens in Puerto Rico, or it fucking shouldn't be. If Puerto Rico opts for statehood, it would be the first place that, in a fascinating sort of mishmash of peoples and ideologies, would be to some extent. Not that Puerto Rico doesn't have its own, Spanish-speaking white elite that would have tremendous power, but I think that I don't know. It's fascinating. It's a really fascinating question. How that would work for Puerto Rico statehood. I would like Puerto Rico statehood to happen. It's not yet clear to me that the most of the 3 million Puerto Ricans would want U.S. statehood to happen. So yeah, these are interesting questions. EM says, do you think the UAE-Israel collaboration will continue, or was it interrupted by the U.S. block of the F-35? Or is it going to continue as good as it started during Trump? Yeah, I think the UAE, the thing about the UAE-Israel collaboration is that it was already happening before the Abraham Accords and is going to continue happening after the Abraham Accords, even if the F-35 block continues. I wouldn't be surprised if Biden found a way to sell them the F-35 anyway. But that was sort of one quibble with the Abraham Accords that I think is 100% accurate. Is that they're largely bullshit. They're largely Trump taking credit for developments that were already happening in the context of U.S. What's the word I'm looking for? In the context of Arabs and Israelis getting together, being freaked out about Iran. These are dynamics that were already happening, and Trump sort of took a lot of credit for those dynamics that aren't, sure, okay. But it's not necessarily, it's not anything clever or different that they did. And the affinity between Israel and the UAE against Iran isn't going to disappear just because Biden didn't sell the F-35s. Okay, we are coming. I think we're coming to the end here. I will continue blathering if anybody adds a super chat. I'll answer the question associated with the super chat, but if not, I'm just going to start spieling. My name is Robert Morris, every Tuesday, without fail, since March of 2014, I have uploaded a video on this channel. Usually they're more produced than this. I do a live chat, a big public live chat like this once a big public live chat like this once a month. And then I also do a private chat for the patrons only once a month. That's a lot of fun too. And that covers a whole range of topics. I actually prep, like 10 to 15 separate little mini topics that I talk about in depth with the 5 to 10 people who show up for the live chat for that. I read every question, engage with all of them. At this point, maybe it'll get too big to a point where I can't do that, but that's the way it is now. Yeah, if you sign up on Patreon, you get access to that patrons only live monthly chat. I do want to start doing a newsletter. You can sign up for that as well. I think probably in the description here. If you don't want to commit to the ongoing crowdfunding thing through Patreon, you can also make a donation through PayPal. I've written a number of books and essays, 3 of which are available in both paperback form and for the Amazon Kindle. That would be Fatka and the New Birth of American Empire is one of them. Everybody's Lying About Islam, which focuses on Saudi Arabia, the U.S.-Saudi relationship and the effect that it has had. What's the word I'm looking for? Israel, Saudi. Yeah, and then, of course, Avoiding the British Empire, which basically describes what the British Empire was, I think more straightforwardly than most U.S. history courses, and lays out how similar the U.S. and British empires are. So I would suggest giving that a look. If you want to keep the conversation going all month long, you can join me on Twitter at RoboLaw. That's my Twitter. You can follow me there, where I am engaging with folks all the time. And you can follow me on Instagram at The Golden Age, which is a good time. Oh wait, no, that's at The Golden Age. That's on Instagram. Yeah, my branding's not very consistent, is it? Regardless, thank you so much. Yes, super chat. Sorry, Vado. And I think I've done most of my spieling. Mert Mifdul says no questions. Nice stream to listen to. Thanks, Mert. Appreciate that. Very generous patron. Grateful. Fadel as well. Very generous. Very grateful. If Israel was smart, they'd ally with the GNA. I think that's a very interesting suggestion. So what Fadel's talking about is the Government of National Accord in Libya, which is supported by the Turks. It's one of the fascinating, underappreciated elements of one of the bigger geopolitical events of the end of last year was the Azerbaijan waging an offensive war to take back territory that Armenia had occupied in Azerbaijan since a war in the early 1990s, late 80s and early 1990s. What was fascinating about this was that Azerbaijan was primarily supported by Turkey, or most publicly supported by Turkey, a country that has a lot of its public relations is about the affinity that Turks have for each other. The Azerbaijani Turks speak languages very similar to the Turkish Turks, different religion, different culture, society, but very performatively, brothers, they are brothers, or what have you. Made a video called Azerbaijan is Not Turkey that did fairly well last fall. But one of the most interesting aspects of that conflict, which Azerbaijan very much won, very militarily, which is, not a great thing for human society, for wars to be successful and winning, was the fact that the Israelis teamed up with the Turks to support the Azerbaijanis. Israel, which is of course not, the Israelis are the never again, people, and the Armenians felt quite betrayed because they felt that this was a Turkish genocidal plot that the Israelis, helped them out with. I don't think that's really fair, but that is certainly the way that a lot of Armenians feel about it. But yeah, Israel and Turkey were selling selling drone stuff to Azerbaijan. That's what they used to win the war so convincingly, and providing diplomatic cover for them. And the Iranians are legitimately aligned. Sorry, the Israelis are legitimately aligned with Azerbaijan on a couple different spheres because I think they see Azerbaijan as a line towards destabilizing Iran because Iran has a very large Azeri Turk population. So that's a very interesting dynamic. So, okay, so if in one conflict, Iran and if in one conflict, Turkey and Israel are on the same side, why can't they be on the same side in another conflict? And I think that's, I think actually that's kind of interesting if we're talking about that like tantalizing idea of a sort of Judeo-Arabic bloc. Yeah, it would essentially cost them very little to attempt to provide capacity building for the government of national accord in Libya, the sort of internationally approved government. And the interesting thing here is like Saudi Arabia and the UAE are kind of in a position where they don't have, there's no other port in the storm for them. They've already sort of made their commitment to Israel. So even though the UAE and Saudi Arabia are very much opposed to the government of national accord in Libya, what can they do if Israel decides to opt for them? So yeah, that's sort of an interesting question. I don't know. An interesting question to close with. Thank you so much for the super chat, Fadal. I think I've done all the spieling I want to spiel. So I think, yeah, it's been about 2 hours. So I think it is time for me to say goodbye. Thank you so much. The More Freedom Foundation is really all of you. None of this is possible without the folks who engage with this content. And also, of course, the folks who choose to support me through crowdfunding, PayPal, purchasing essays, that sort of thing. I am very grateful. And thank you all for making this possible. And have a great day.